Hello, thank you all for coming. There are a reasonable number of you. So I think that there has been more of a crowd on this front lawn maybe once or twice, perhaps for Oprah, but not that often. So, which brings me, Shashi, actually very easily to my first question. Objectively, and I want you to do this as objectively as possible, why do you think you're so popular?
Oh, that's a very subjective question, not objective at all.
Completely objective.
Honestly, if you went on my social media timeline, particularly on Twitter, you wouldn't think I'm popular at all. So it all depends on perspective. I guess the people who've taken the trouble to spend an hour of their life with me probably like me.
Yeah, well, you know, one's persona on social media is not always a fair reflection of actual popularity. But what I wanted to try and get at was, and to maybe start with the supposed subject of this talk, is to what degree do you think that a lot of younger people in India admire you precisely because of your ability to use the English language well? I know this is a serious question.
Well, I hope there's a lot more than that. I mean, this English language thing is kind of a joke that ran out of control. I mean, it is true that I have read rather widely and indiscriminately over the years and acquired, therefore, a somewhat wide-ranging vocabulary. But I'm very conscious that one writes in order to be heard. Your purpose of communication is to be understood. So there would really be no point in using words that people don't understand unless there was a particular reason that that word was better than any alternative. Now, it so happens, I think this entire thing happened with that, when I got angry with a certain anchor who shall not be named and accused him of a farrago of misrepresentations, innuendos and lies, and didn't realize in my flaming rage in writing that tweet that every one of those words, except lies, was not particularly widely understood. And suddenly there was this hysteria that day when the search for the word farrago in India spiked, and where the Oxford English Dictionary tweeted that they'd never seen such an extraordinary search for one word coming out of India. And that became a bit of a joke. Simply because, honestly, I've been using that expression or variations of it, but with the word farrago since my college days. You know, farrago being a confused mixture. In any college debating, you always want to accuse your opponents of being confused and mixed up. So farrago was a very handy word, and I kind of retrieved it from the mists of collegiate memory and found it suddenly going viral, 40 years later. But thereafter, I must admit, when people started paying more attention to the words I was using, then I kind of took it as a kind of joke that I could actually use people's interest in unusual words, even though when I first used that phrase, I hadn't realized it was that unusual, that I could take people's interest in unusual words and make a point of something larger. So for example, when a certain unnamed chief minister of Bihar switched from one coalition to another, rather than make a specific comment on that, I just said word of the day, snollygoster, first used US 1848, meaning a shrewd and unprincipled politician. Most contemporary use, and I gave the day's date, the date of his defection. And so the word became a way of making a political point. Or when I was announcing the release of my latest book, The Paradoxical Prime Minister, I thought a writer announcing a book is, I'm afraid, a dime a dozen. But I could get people talking about it if I used a word that might capture their imagination. And so I tweeted, my book, The Paradoxical Prime Minister, is more than just a 500-page exercise in floxi nosi nihil pilification. And that, needless to say, is not a word one uses in everyday conversation, but using it, as I said, as a joke also became a means of getting people talking about the book. And of course, I come across legions of 6-year-olds who've been forced by their parents to memorize that word and so on. I feel quite dreadful about what I've unleashed on the nation.
But I think part of, aside from the use of words, there is something about fluency with expression, and not just in English, that does appeal to younger people in India. And I think that is, I remember once some years ago, I think you were on stage somewhere with Chetan Bhagat, and I can't recall what the context of this was. But it was in Delhi, and a large number of people, particularly college students and MBA students from the margin of the capital, of the national capital region, had come. And it was very interesting that they talked about the two of you, and Chetan Bhagat, in very similar ways. All right, it is not, both of you were admired, among other things, among whatever other individual qualities, admired collectively for your ability to express ideas. And it seems that is something that people feel we are a little short of in this country. Am I wrong here?
Well, that's gratifying because my entire perception of my role in politics is to advance ideas. I'm not a traditional politician, as everyone knows, but I do feel that politics provides me a platform to advance a certain vision of India, or what I think is better for India, or good for India, and for the kind of country that I have already been thinking about and writing about for more than 35 years. I mean, my first book, The Reasons of State, was actually my PhD thesis rehash, so maybe that doesn't count. That came out in 1981. But my first novel, The Great Indian Novel, is exactly going to be 30 years old this year. And for 3 decades, I have tried to write about India, a vision of India, an image of India as a pluralist land, as a land in which some of the more important issues facing the world at the beginning of the 21st century, or that point at the end of the 20th, were being sorted out, as it were being settled, were being determined by the efforts of these millions of people, and now over 1 billion people, trying to find the right answers to these fundamental crises. And to be part of that story, to be part of that adventure, is what politics enables me to do and to be. So it's in that spirit that I've approached it. And if I'm able to get those ideas across, and ideally in simple enough words, then I will feel I've achieved something, because positions come and go, right? I mean, I'm already a former minister. One day, no doubt, I'll be a former MP, but I hope never to be a former writer. The writing is a vehicle for the ideas, just as politics is.
So, which I suppose brings one to the question of why, when you returned, you thought that you needed to do it as a politician, if one wished to express ideas. So, which I guess there are 2 parts to that thing. How long did you think before you jumped into politics in India that you would be doing it? And at what points in the past have you regretted that decision, if any?
Well, why did I get into it? I think, frankly, I come from a completely non-political family background. My father was a newspaper executive. My mother was a homemaker who wrote the occasional household hints columns in Femina and places like that. It just wasn't considered something worth doing. I did have a taste for an interest in politics from a young age, and I kept getting elected to things at school and college. I was elected president of St. Stephen's College Students' Union, which was, not a bad thing to contest for, because it's a highly visible...
A very famous who was your election manager again? Remind us.
Chandan Mitra was my campaign manager. Those days he was a Trotskyite. So I mean, we've moved, as it were. I was this, by his standards, a flaming conservative, because I was moderate. And he was quite left. Now he's moved all the way across to the right.
Oh no, he's back in the center, remember?
Now he's back in the center, I beg your pardon, that's right. The pendulum does swing in both directions. But anyway, so at the same time, I never thought of conventional politics. In fact, frankly, for most middle-class professional households, the parents' attitude tends to be, you study hard, do well in your exams, and get a good job, because politics is for the guys who can't do well in the exams. I mean, that tends to be the attitude. Now, I'm glad to say that that's changing, and we've seen already this morning in Sachin Pilot an example of somebody of a different stamp. But for someone like me, having that kind of background and not having any political connections or patronage, I never thought of politics as a realistic option. The UN gave me an opportunity to deal with issues I cared about, global issues, but I also cared about India. And you had this paradox of this guy sitting in New York or Geneva, writing books about India and writing books in which clearly my urgent sort of passion and the sort of repeated scratching of an itch about India, about what's made it, what's nearly unmade it, how it can be remade, all of that was very much present. But when I contested for Secretary General, failed narrowly, but failed nonetheless, close but no cigar, as Groucho Marx would say, I then had to step out and look around and see what I was going to do with myself. And paradoxically, that failure opened a door. I mean, the old cliche about when one door shuts, another window opens. And this window opened because I think the visibility that I got from that run encouraged some political parties to come to me and say, would you be interested in contesting? And I had become quite attracted to the role that the Congress Party had played since 1991 in particular. And when they approached me, I thought, great, this is something I wouldn't think about twice. If I had known anything of what it was like, I might never have had the courage to join. The 3 weeks of the election campaign in my first, in 2009, were the hardest 3 weeks I'd ever spent doing anything. We literally had 23-hour days. I was so unused to standing for the last week of the campaign on this Paryatan vehicle, which is a converted jeep with iron bars around it, that all the jostling and moving and shuttling meant that I was bashing against the iron bars all day. It was black and blue and bleeding literally each day for a week. It was quite an extraordinary experience. People have no idea how hard campaigning can be. But at the end of it all, I won, and I won a resounding victory, and that gave me the taste for doing it. You asked me, have I ever regretted it? Yeah, I mean, I think, my arrival on the scene was not welcomed by many. And I went through quite a few Agni Parikshas, particularly in my first term, which were painful and also untypical. There weren't any other politicians who seemed to have endured anything similar to what I had to go through. And as a result, the sort of perforated back I got from all the stiletto stabs, exactly, and the bullet wounds in the front and the stab wounds in the back, did make me wonder why the heck I was doing this. But A, I'm not a quitter. B, I had made a very complicated choice to leave behind not just Western world and good money and good comforts, but also family. Both my sons were in the West. And I was giving all that up to come and make an effort. And I would be damned if I was going to be driven out of it by either resentment or jealousy or whatever it was that people were using to attack me. And I'm proud to say that by sticking to it and taking the blows, I've come through, I won't say unscathed, but I'm still there. And what's more, I won a second term in difficult circumstances. And I believe I've been able to shift the needle in the national conversation on a number of issues ranging from nationalism to economics to social issues at home, the 377, women's rights, all sorts of things which to my mind needed to be done in the political space.
So, as a politician, therefore, who got into this for, as you said, talking about the ideas and pushing the needle in this manner, and as somebody who is, you were described to me earlier today as loquacious. Do you feel that that's...
Loquacious is the unkind form of eloquent.
So do you feel that eloquence / loquaciousness has been helpful or hurtful in some ways?
I think both. Mm-hmm. Depends on what the context is and where.
Sometimes they've used your words to attack you, or your...
Yeah, exactly.
The first time that you got into trouble was cattle class. And
within a few months after that, interlocutor.
Yes.
I don't know, many of you are probably familiar with this cattle class thing. It was when the government imposed an austerity drive, and a BJP-leaning journalist, though I didn't know that at the time, asked me on Twitter, so Mr. Minister, does this mean you will travel cattle class? Because there's an austerity drive. And I replied, without giving it much thought, yes, I will travel cattle class out of solidarity with all our holy cows. Now, you may not find that funny, and clearly a majority of you didn't, But it was only meant in a light-hearted spirit because the expression cattle class has been around for 3 decades. I didn't make it up, nor did the journalist who was using it. I had lived in the Western world for quite some time and had seen this phrase so many times. It was never meant to be an insult to passengers. It was meant to be an attack on airlines for herding us into their coach class like cattle. So that was why cattle class. But in fact, when I used it, of course, the proverbial dung hit the fan. And the next thing I knew was that I was being attacked on the front page of every Indian newspaper while I was busy traveling in Africa. And I was even being my resignation was being demanded by some of my own party colleagues. Why? Because apparently the use of that phrase suggested I was some sort of snooty elitist. And that clearly was a line of argument that had a bit of malice embedded in it. Or a few months later when I used the very familiar to UN diplomats word, interlocutor, which merely means the person you're talking to. So right now, MIHIR is my interlocutor. I am his interlocutor. So when I was asked about how our Prime Minister had gone to Saudi Arabia when the Saudis were so friendly with Pakistan, I said, that makes Saudi Arabia all the more valuable an interlocutor to us because they have good relations with a country we have a problem with. Suddenly that interlocutor was interpreted, again, I believe maliciously by our favorite anchor and others, as meaning intermediary. And there's accusation that I had stood India's entire foreign policy on its head by making Saudi Arabia an intermediary with Pakistan. So it was one thing after another like that. And yes, to that degree, words have got me into trouble. But it's also true that, and there's one more context where it gets me into trouble, which is my answers, as you've just seen, tend to be so long that journalists will take one bit out of context and make me sound perhaps a little more irresponsible than I really am. That also comes from eloquence.
So, the subject of this discussion is technically Tharoorism, by which I suppose they mean, or Tharoorisms, by which I suppose they mean these words. But you've been talking a lot about the ideas that you want to push forward. And so have you ever felt confident in the notion that there is a Tharoorism in the sense of how to manage our social changes, how to manage social cleavages? Is there an ideology in some sense that you are striving towards?
Well, I think of myself as an instinctive liberal, and not just in terms of economic principles, which largely you and I would share, or even political ones, but simply as an attitude to life. I tend not to judge people for who they are. I tend to accept them as they are, to allow them to be themselves, to seek to become what they want to become, so long as they don't harm others. And that's a sort of gut instinct reaction to people and to the world. And in that sense, I approach most issues that way. So I say, why should the government be in the bedroom and tell people what they can and cannot do? Why should the government tell people whom they can love? Why should the government tell people what they can eat? Any more than they can intrude in other aspects of personal life. So I've been in that sense an advocate of these changes, using the Parliament and the private members' bill vehicle in Parliament to expand these things. But I've also had a fairly urgent commitment to social justice, and I've tried to push welfare, for example, migrant workers' rights. I tried to move a bill that would give domestic workers rights, protection, and minimum wage, as well as leave in our country. A lot of these things. And plus, I am a believer in using democracy to promote our own development growth through the most efficient means possible. And I have therefore, for example, tried to push a bill to get directly elected mayors in our towns and cities, precisely because that's the only way in which a mayor, accountable to the voters, but with the executive authority and the budgetary capacity, can actually take decisions that change lives in a city. Right now, every Indian mayor, almost every Indian mayor, does vary slightly from state to state, is nothing more than the glorified chairman of a municipal committee, none of whose members either have any power. And the real power is always exercised by an unelected IAS officer called the municipal commissioner. So there are flaws in our system. One can't rewrite the constitution overnight, but one can raise these issues. I have no immediate expectation that any of these bills will pass, but the point about ideas is once they're out there, They infect people's minds. They animate articles, op-eds, discussions, and they provoke the kind of consideration that one day might bring about change. So that may be a somewhat evolutionary approach, but it's mine.
So, I mean, I suppose in that context, something that in the past few months, at least to a lot of us in the North, has been a little confusing, maybe because we don't understand a lot about it, is the Sabrimala temple question in Kerala. And here, I think a lot of people were in fact disappointed with your intervention on it. So I wanted to ask you to try and put what you were saying and restate maybe what you were saying and then put it in the context of what you were just telling me of pushing the needle on a bunch of different things.
Well, MIHIR, when the issue first came up, that is in 2016, the then newly elected left government in Kerala changed their affidavit, the affidavit given by the previous Congress-led UDF government, which was against opening up the temple to the restricted age group of reproductive women. And the left changed that, and I was asked by the media, and I said, I think the left is right on this one. I think we should allow everyone to go in. And at that time, it wasn't a big issue because the court judgment was a long way away and no one paid much attention, though it is on record and has since been resurrected on Twitter and so on. Then the judgment actually came in September of last year. And when the judgment came, saying that the temple shall be open to women 10 to 50, I immediately welcomed it, and I explained to skeptical Malayali journalists who were disappointed by my welcoming the Supreme Court decision that change can often come ahead of society through judiciary. I used to give the example of the American court judgment called Brown versus the Board of Education, which desegregated American schools that had hitherto been reserved for whites and blacks separately. And I said that that was a judgment that was well ahead of anything that the legislature, the US Congress, might have been prepared to do. And yet it came and it moved. Now, of course, no one thinks that you can segregate schools anymore. And I said, people will get used to it. But boy, was I wrong. And when I say was I was wrong because of the ferocious backlash, not just from conservative men, as most people assume, but from society as a whole and from an overwhelming number of the women whom I met and spoke to about this. And the reason was, I had framed the issue as one of equality. Their answer was, this is not about equality. We consider ourselves equal in Kerala, which is a progressive state. This is about sanctity. It is about the sanctity of the temple. If we want to worship Lord Ayyappa, there are 100 Ayyappa temples where women of any age are allowed. But the Sabrimala shrine has a particular set of myths and legends associated with it, as a result of which Ayyappa, the deity, is seen there, and only there, as a Neshtikar Brahmachari, and that he has vowed never to set eyes on a woman of reproductive age until he agrees to marry Mallika Puratamma, the sister of Mahishasur, for whom there is a shrine across the way on the top of Sabrimala as well. And, you may laugh at these stories, but the fact is faith was never meant to be rational. If you're a good Catholic, you believe in the virgin birth and the Immaculate Conception. If you're a good Muslim, you believe the Archangel Gabriel came down and revealed the word of God, the Prophet Muhammad. You've got all of these different beliefs in religion that cannot be subjected to objective, rational, demonstrable scientific test. So why here? Another problem was the large number of temples in India where similar restrictions exist for both genders. So in Kanyakumari, there is a temple to the Virgin Goddess, the Kanya Devi, where men are not allowed into the sanctum sanctorum. They can go to the outer courtyard of the temple, but not inside. Now, if you apply the same principle of the Supreme Court, and a man is able to walk in tomorrow, would he not affect the sanctity of that shrine to lakhs of women? And so these questions began to be asked very seriously. And many women said to me, look, we're ready to wait. Now, obviously, anecdotal evidence is never good enough. And many would argue that the absolute principle that constitutionalism requires there should be no discrimination should be applied, in which case we'll have to apply it to 100 other temples in this country, and there will probably be a mass uproar. Now, all I can say is, we do unfortunately accept in many societies that whereas, say, gender equality is an absolute principle, the Catholic Church is allowed not to appoint women as bishops and priests, whereas the Anglican Church does, or that in many Sunni mosques, the women are not allowed to pray in the same room as the men, but are in a different balcony or a different room. Now you can say the constitutional principle of gender equality applies, doesn't it? No, it doesn't to those. So why, many people ask, and the BJP leaps on this, why is a Hindu shrine being singled out to impose a principle you wouldn't impose elsewhere? And this got caught up in this entire drama of the politics of Kerala. Because we have a communist government in power today, which gleefully seized on this judgment for a very simple political objective, which was to provoke enough of a BJP, Hindutva, Sangh Parivar backlash to take away Congress Hindu votes to such an extent that the left candidates would win. That's their political strategy. So the left, which has shown no zeal in implementing any other Supreme Court judgment, there's a 7-month-old judgment in a case involving two factions of the Orthodox Church. And the communists are not touching the implementation because they know that they need votes on both sides. But when it comes to this one, this for them is a political win because the BJP has reacted predictably. They have gone out into the streets, vandalized cars, attacked the police, thrown stones, obstructed the potential worshippers, and as a result, been able to convince a certain segment of Hindu voters that the BJP is the only party out there that will stand up for Hindu rights and interests. And in the process, the left feels their biggest enemy politically, the Congress, will lose enough votes so that the left candidates will win in the forthcoming elections. Now, as far as I'm concerned, that's not an agenda that I would like to play into. And so I did review my position, and I said, for me, as a political representative, I owe respect to the wishes of my voters. Now, people will have turned around and said, but would you not have said that for untouchability? I would say no. Would you not say that for sati? I'd say no. But why do you say it for this? Because there are, I would say, 4 basic principles that any democratic politician has to espouse. Respect for the Constitution and its institutions, including the Supreme Court. Respect, it seems to me, for the freedom of religion and the rights of religions to practice their own rituals as they wish, as long as they don't harm others. Respect as a democrat for the rule of law, and respect for the wishes of the people, because you are supposed to be their representative. Now, normally all 4 principles I'm able to hold up at the same time. Shabarimala is the first time and first issue, and I hope the only issue, on which these principles seem to clash with each other. I cannot turn to my voters, the people I represent in Parliament, saying, I understand what you're saying, but I don't take your view seriously enough. That, to my mind, is not a tenable position for a people's representative. Equally, I do want the Supreme Court to be respected, which is why my party and I, while standing with the believers, has refused to participate in the political vandalism, protests, and violence or obstruction that has taken place. We don't want to see a sacred shrine reduced to a stage of political theater. We have said, let's go to the Supreme Court, conduct a review, see what the court decides, and then we can see what's the best way forward, taking everyone along with us.
But when you say your party, I mean, I think it's fair to say that there is something of a division between, I wouldn't say the central leadership, but the central opinions outside Kerala and the Congress within Kerala on how to handle this.
Though our party president, Rahul Gandhi, recently said a few days ago that he sees merit in both sides of the argument because he's heard this other side of the argument from enough of his colleagues in Kerala. So I don't think there is such a rift at all. In any case, in a democratic party, there should always be room for more than one opinion. And by the way, I wasn't the only one to change my opinion. Amusingly enough, the BJP had earlier expressed, BJP and the RSS had expressed an opinion in favor of the verdict. And the day the BJP was beginning its protest demonstrations in Shabarimala, ironically, their newspaper carried a pro-women's entry editorial that clearly had been planned before they turned their position on a dime. So there's a lot of cynicism and opportunism involved on both sides.
But to sort of step back from this particular instance to the larger question of sometimes central institutions aren't getting things right, maybe for some of us in the north, this felt a little bit like what happened with Jallikattu in Tamil Nadu, where what appeared to be a perfectly reasonable Supreme Court judgment to us became something that we didn't understand because it seemed to touch on some form of pride or ethnic nationalism that had been submerged, not that submerged in Tamil Nadu politics, but not front and center maybe as it had been 30 or 40 years earlier. Are national institutions getting states right?
There's a very good question, but you know what the Tamil Nadu legislature did was to pass a law that in effect nullified the Supreme Court judgment. If the BJP was sincere in saying that they were against this for reasons of protecting certain traditions and so on, they have a crushing majority in the Lok Sabha. They could have passed a law or even a constitutional amendment on this matter. They've not done so because they don't want a solution. They want the gadar in the streets. That's what they really want. And that's what's so frustrating about this issue. You know, in America, oddly enough, there was a freedom of religion bill piloted by no one less than Bill Clinton in order to permit and protect certain forms of religious worship which had been found unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. So clearly this is not just an Indian problem, let alone just a Kerala problem. There are global issues here. Religion is a very, very unusual thing. It is not comparable to any other kind of human activity because it deals with some of human beings' most fundamental existential doubts, misgivings, yearnings, fears, and hopes. It is tied up in a level of faith that has nothing to do with that is not susceptible to reasoning or debate. And ultimately, either you believe or you don't believe. Now, I happen to have a heck of a lot of people in my state who do believe. And I have to show that I am responsive and attentive to their concerns. That's what a political representative is supposed to do. I know I've got absolutely bashed by a lot of my liberal friends, many of whom have actually stood by me on other issues where I've been tough, and I feel sorry that they have felt this way. But, you know, they're not where I am. They're not, you know, where you stand depends on where you sit sometimes, and I'm sitting right in the middle of this.
So now, since you've brought up cynical politics and all that stuff, let's talk about what's happening over the next few months. You've just had a book out which has in which you have been surprisingly harsh, I think, on the Prime Minister. It was a little, you know, it took me by surprise. Well, you know, because Shashi has started Mr. Modi's career by, unlike a lot of the rest of us, saying, look, we have to step back, we have to give him a chance. And you have to admit this chap has won, the Prime Minister has won an enormous majority, and therefore he has the confidence of the people. We have to see what he does with his mandate. And your belief now is that objectively he hasn't used the mandate that he was given.
Exactly, and it's not just now, it started a bit earlier. What happened was when he was first elected, and I made the statements that MIHIR is quoting, it was for two reasons, and I said so at the time. One was out of respect for the wishes of the electorate. They had, after all, just given Mr. Modi a mandate, and I felt as Democrats, we have to respect what the Indian voter has decided. The second, however, was that Mr. Modi was saying all the right things. He was saying, Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas. He was saying, I will be a prime minister for all Indians. He was saying, the Constitution is my only holy book, and so on and on. And I said, we have to not only welcome these statements, but by welcoming them, we are laying out the yardstick against which we can judge him in the future. By saying these are the things that he has said, we're going to say, have you lived up to this? That would be the basis. Whereas if we have criticized him, even when he's saying the right things, it undermines our ability to criticize him when he does the wrong things. That was essentially my argument. But within 6 months, and some of you will remember this because I came to Jaipur in January of 2015, having published a book called India Shastra, Reflections on the Nation in Our Time, which was basically a collection of pieces written over the 6-7 years preceding it. But in an introductory essay, I wrote that there is a central contradiction to what we're seeing about Mr. Modi. He says all these liberal things, he makes all these pronouncements, but he rests for his own political support and his electoral viability across the country on the most illiberal elements in Indian society. And I wrote, in this contradiction may lie the seeds of his future failure. That was in December of 2014, 6 months after he came to power. So when I began my book, The Paradoxical Prime Minister, I was able to begin it with the words, "I told you so," because I actually quoted this passage, and this was published at that time. And unfortunately, Mr. Modi has spent the next 4.5 years proving me right, because he has made all of these rather severe mistakes and disappointed. And I must say there are many sections. I have a section on what I call the Modification of India, the growing intolerance, communal discourse, cow vigilantism, all of those things. I have a section on Modi and governance, where the only kind of minimum government, he said minimum government, maximum governance, right? We've seen absolutely disastrous governance, and the only minimum government is that the rest of the government is completely irrelevant. It's all Mr. Modi and the PMO. That's the minimum government we've got. And I talk about how that's functioned, and then I talk about economics, which is more MIHIR's strong suit. But everything, including particularly the disaster of demonetization and the body blow it delivered to our GDP growth rates and the future of our country, all of that is something that I go into. And finally, I have a section on foreign policy. I mention these because some of these were the areas in which even critics of Mr. Modi grudgingly hoped. You know, there were people who thought, Chalo, he's now put this Hindutva stuff behind him. He's going to come and be the CEO of India Inc., the way he has developed Gujarat, etc. He had let us down on both counts. Not only was he not an effective CEO of India Inc., but he was also somebody who was completely unable to let go of the Hindutva tiger he had ridden to the top. And so in many ways, my disappointment is, even as somebody who had hoped that, well, there were some things I may never agree with him about, such as Hindutva, there might be other things such as economic growth where I could have, as an Indian citizen, have a reason to be happy. Unfortunately, he did not succeed there either.
Let's talk a little bit about the style of governance that you alluded to, you know, the centralization, one-man PMO, and talk very specifically about the ability or inability to draft people into government, the way that, you know, Dr. Singh, for example, brought you in, or brought in Nandan. Is there a sense, I mean, I would have thought, given the overwhelming support from the middle class, from budding technocrats, that the Prime Minister received in 2014, that this would be a much less political, much less bureaucratic, and much more expertise-driven government. Why do you think it is running so vastly short of expertise?
Well, I think it's definitely short of expertise amongst the political ranks. That is, the BJP members who've been appointed as ministers are, for the most part, not up to the jobs they hold. And we have seen time and time again during question hour in Parliament, on the rare occasions question hour was able to function, we have seen ministers completely out of their depth, or reading out aloud slips of paper passed to them by their bureaucrats. And to that degree, the paucity of talent across the ranks of the ruling party has been sadly rather apparent. There have been a handful of ministers who seem at ease with their portfolios, but literally only a handful. Now, having said that, Mr. Modi's way of compensating for this appears to have been to rely on bureaucrats. Either he relies on bureaucrats by bypassing their ministers, which he's been doing a fair bit of, or he appoints bureaucrats to formally political positions. So his last cabinet reshuffle, he appointed 4 new ministers, 3 were retired bureaucrats.
And may I also point out that the retired bureaucrats did not seem to be put into positions relevant to their, so somebody from the Foreign Service was put in the Urban Development Ministry, somebody who knows about urban development was put in elsewhere. So it was very puzzling, actually, to see you're bringing in bureaucrats because of their expertise, and then you're putting them in something which they've never thought. You put some, you know, they have to learn on the job. What's the point?
Exactly. I couldn't have put it better.
Well, you should have. This is what we rely on you for, Shashi. All right, we've got about 20 minutes left, and because Shashi is not known for brief answers, I'm going to now turn to the audience and try and get beyond the back. So why don't we start with the lady in the white in the middle row there. Could you stand up, ma'am? Yes.
Good evening.
Good evening.
sir. In politics, it is the narratives that we use that, actually lays the path out for the future. So the narrative that you have used or most people have used on Sabrimala is the Naistika Brahmacharya. There is also the other narrative which talks about, I don't remember the name, but the tribal gods.
The Malayaryans.
Yeah. So if you are choosing, these are all oral traditions, these are all, there is nothing documented. So we are conveniently using the argument that fits our electoral purposes. That, to me, is a huge, huge disappointment.
Okay, let me respond to that in a different way. I'm not going to argue with you, but let me ask you, if you believe that the ideas, the ideals, the issues that I have been working on, pushing and propagating across my 10 years in politics and in parliament are worthy of support and worthy of perpetuation, and that therefore these ideas should be given a chance to continue being perpetuated and propagated from the parliamentary platform, would you not think it would be foolish of me to deny myself the opportunity to get those ideas across by losing an election on the issue, on any one issue, this one or any other? I mean, it's literally, until you understand the intensity of the feelings of the vast majority of your voters, you will not have, you will be able to have the luxury of an academic position. But for me, I'm talking to people every day. I mean, just last week, there were a lack of people in the Puttirikandam Maidan in Thiruvananthapuram opposing women's entry, and the vast majority of them were women of the age of reproduction. And the photographs in the newspapers will tell you the story. What can we do about this? This is what people believe. They really feel that this court judgment has kicked them in the gut. It's as visceral as that. In fact, a Muslim League leader was saying to me that the only parallel he could imagine in his political lifetime was the way he and others like him felt when the Babri Masjid was destroyed. That is the intensity of feeling. Now, when I was cheerfully answering as an intellectual, I did give a different answer, the answer that would have apparently made you happy. But I'm no longer answering as an intellectual. I'm answering as a political representative who is accountable to his voters and his people to represent their concerns fairly in the public space.
Yeah, but as a political representative, as a leader in an organization, in a corporate place, I am looking to the leader to set the path. So if the leader is playing ball to the constituency, knowing well that he could change the thought, he could change society. He could do what Mahatma Gandhi did. He could do what, I'm sure we are nowhere near Mahatma Gandhi. I'm sure you would agree to, I hope.
That's why I shook my head.
We can definitely do a lot more than just playing ball.
Okay, thanks. Shashi, I'll let you answer that.
I do take your point. Just to say very briefly that as far as changing society is concerned, as you know, the communist government today is trying to do precisely that. They got women's organizations and others to stand together in a gesture of solidarity called the Women's Wall. But the moment they said that was on this issue, most of the women, or many of the women who participated, immediately denounced the wall they had stood in and said our standing had nothing to do with the wall. Had nothing to do with Sabrimala, I beg your pardon. Had to do only with the Navodhanam, the Renaissance of Kerala, which is what the issue was sold to us as. Not the Sabrimala issue, but the issue of the wall. So there are all of these complications. I'm afraid the politics of this are truly inextricable from the issue as they are. But I respect your point of view. And believe me, many in my family would agree with you. I'm not taking an easy way out. At the same time, by grasping the nettle, I'm doing what I consider to be the responsible thing for the larger issues that I do wish to pursue.
Just to follow up on that, Shashi, do you feel that it was impossible to stay silent if you did not agree with your constituents?
You know, that's obviously the answer. I mean, I frankly did stay silent for a month after my initial welcoming of the judgment. But the problem is I have a conscience. And I felt that for myself, as much to explain my position to myself as to the voters, that as somebody who had constantly engaged in public reflection and debate, I mean, why do I write these political articles? It's very much to engage with people about the ideas that matter to me, that it would be hypocritical of me to stay silent. And that's why I've written just 2 pieces on this, but both fairly lengthy, in both Malayalam and English. And I did so in order to explain precisely to people of goodwill who understand that the stand I've taken is based on something, whether they disagree with that something or not. I felt I needed to lay it out as to what my thinking was.
Yeah.
Mr. Tharoor, you just mentioned that you, I think, guarded yourself by saying you're a political representative here. Nevertheless, my question to you is, what is it with the Congress party and the workers? Earlier in the morning today, I heard Mr. Pilot, a thinking individual, dynamic person. I've been hearing you, reading your book. You have enough of leaders and leadership. What is it that you all bow down to the Gandhi family and you listen to a person like Rahul Gandhi? Thank you.
A party is a political vehicle. A party is a vehicle for ideas. It is the machine through which candidates are elected. It's also an embodiment of a set of values, a kind of thinking that is right for the country. Today, essentially, we are down to a choice between 2 kinds of thinking. I would even go so far as to say the forthcoming elections is a battle for India's soul, because we have seen a fundamentally different idea of India being advocated by those close to the ruling party. And to me, therefore, there was no choice. If you believe in the kind of idea that emerged from the freedom struggle, where one set of people said that religion should be the determinant of nationhood, and that was the idea of Pakistan, and another set of people said, no, religion will not be the basis of our nation. We will be a nation of everyone and for everyone, and that was the idea of India. We now see a determined effort to smuggle in the idea of Pakistan into India. And I think that needs to be resisted. To my mind, therefore, the vehicle that is credible nationally, what do we have? We basically have the Congress on the one hand, the BJP on the other, and a whole bunch of regional parties. Even the Communist Party is basically a regional party. It could be calling itself Kerala Desam if it wanted to, because it really has no other presence anywhere else. So the question is, which side of the line do you find yourself on this big existential, moral, political question? To my mind, the only conceivable line is that of the Congress. Now, it so happens that in the Congress, the DNA of the party is inextricably linked with that of the Gandhi family. If tomorrow there were a free and fair election pitting our present Congress president against anyone you could care to name in the Congress party, I assure you he would win the election hands down amongst Congress workers. Now, the point is, a party, its leadership is determined by its workers, its culture is determined by its members and its party officials and so on. And therefore, those of us who recognize that in the Congress party, if we wish to pursue certain ideals, we accept the party the way it is, then the question that you ask essentially becomes irrelevant. It's not a question we need to ask ourselves, because indeed, in the phrase that Mr. Modi's supporters love to say, there is no alternative. And in the Congress party, there is no alternative.
So I have a supplementary to that. Why is it that people, in your opinion, you seem to think of politics, therefore, as a battle of ideas,
Yeah.
which is how you've just expressed it. But a large number of people, and I'm sure many of the people in the audience, seem to think of politics instead as a battle of personalities. And you may say that you're in the Congress for a battle of because it is on the right side in the battle of ideas. And others may claim that, yes, but it is permanently on the wrong side in the battle of personalities, which is right or wrong, we don't need to get into. The problem is that the personality battle seems to be electorally more potent than the ideological battle. So how do you fix that?
Well, First of all, we don't have a presidential system. So we need to educate the voters that when they're voting for an MP, they're really voting for two things. A person who will represent them in parliament and look after their interests, the interests of their constituency. And second, through that person, helping choose a national leader or who will form the government, which party will form the government. That's what the parliamentary system does, and it's not a presidential one. To try and reduce our parliamentary system to a presidential one by saying that it's Mr. Modi versus X or Y is actually an injustice to the system we've got. Because strictly speaking, the only people in this country who get to vote for Mr. Modi are those in the constituency in which he contests, which may or may not be Varanasi. It may be now that he's got all the Pravasis to come and applaud him there. Now, having said that, there's a second argument I want to put before you, which is that in our system, there are actually two very, very contrasting styles of leadership on offer. There is the idea of the leader as the hero on a white stallion with his upraised sword, cantering down saying, I know all the answers, I'll solve all the problems, I'll cut through all the Gordian knots. And that's the idea we've been sold for the last 4.5, 5 years, and we've seen how badly that's worked out. And then there is another idea that comes on foot and not on a white horse, and that says, I don't know all the answers, maybe I don't even know all the questions, but I will ask you what you are most troubled about, what you want me to work on, and I will come with a deep and experienced bench of qualified, able people to work with me and you to solve your problems. That is the other style of leadership. And in our system, in a parliamentary system, that's the way it's supposed to work.
All right, another question. Maybe we can go a little further at the back. Can the young gentleman in the red at the back stand up, please? Yeah.
Good evening. I had a question. You explained major drawbacks that would be there if BJP came into power in 2019. You also mentioned that if they get 2/3 of the majority in Rajya Sabha as well, they will go on rewriting the constitution and they will do anything to what is possible to make India Hindu Rashtra. And secondly, you said this is not the real agenda of BJP. You said that BJP will disclose the real agenda when they will get power in both the houses, Lok Sabha as well as Rajya Sabha. So we are a bit confused which one to believe.
Okay.
No. So I mean, first of all, the BJP and its supporters in the RSS and the Sangh Parivar have never denied. In fact, on the contrary, they have repeated that their agenda is eventually the creation of a Hindu Rashtra. They just haven't had the numbers, because in our system you need both the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha and half the states. Well, they've got 2/3 of the states until the December setback. And had it not been for that setback, they were on course to get an overwhelming majority in the Rajya Sabha within 4 years. So the time that I made that argument was that had they won the 2019 Lok Sabha elections and had also had a majority in the Rajya Sabha, plus already more than half the states, there would be no impediment should they wish to turn India into something that it was never meant to be, a Hindu Rashtra. And the problem with the BJP is facing right now is they've had the setback in 3 states, which means those legislatures will not elect so many BJP MPs anymore. And secondly, that they've got their backs to the wall when it comes to the Lok Sabha elections. They did so well in 2014 that they are going to find it impossible, even in the best case scenario for them, to come close to the numbers they had last time. And therefore, it seems to me this worry is much less today than it was even 3 months or 2 months ago. But basically, their long-term objective is clearly this. And the proof of it is what I was saying earlier about Mr. Modi. You know, in American politics, there's this belief that the Republicans campaign on guns, God, and gays, the sort of cultural nationalism. And then they come to power and implement their real agenda, which is economics. Giving tax breaks to the plutocrats, helping the big multinational corporations, all of that. That's the way the Republicans play bait and switch. In India, it seems to be the opposite. Mr. Modi campaigns on economics, talks about development, and having come to power, the only people who have free reign and are flourishing are the cultural nationalists, the cow vigilantes, the ghar wapasi types, the love jihadis, all of these characters. They're the ones who've been given a free hand, whereas the ostensible agenda of economic development is nowhere to be seen. So that's the proof that the real agenda that matters is power for the sake of a majoritarian Hindutva agenda.
So we're practically out of time, Shashi, and I want to sort of close by asking you to supplementary to that as well, which is, why is it that you do not think that the BJP itself, you know, about 15 years ago, under Vajpayee, there was a sense that maybe the BJP will become a mainstream conservative party. Hindutva will be in its constitution, perhaps, but it won't be actively applied on the ground. That hasn't seemed to happen, and why not?
Why not? Because of two things. One, they got a leader who actually had been raised in the Hindutva tradition as a lifelong RSS pracharak. And secondly, they won a majority they hadn't expected to. Remember, Mr. Vajpayee led a coalition. He had 23 parties in the NDA, of whom only one, the Shiv Sena, shared its Hindutva agenda. Whereas Mr. Modi has coalition partners, but they're naam ke vaste. Even if every one of them left, as Chandrababu Naidu and the RLSP of Upendra Kushwaha have done, even if all the rest left, he still has a majority in the lower house. And therefore, there was a sense of impunity which enabled them to bear their true colors. I think that was the difference between Vajpayee Sahab and Modi ji. Apart from personal temperament, inclination, Mr. Vajpayee being more of a conciliator, Mr. Modi being more of a fighter, all of this stuff, there is also the opportunity cost, as it were, of the number of seats you've got in Parliament.
Thank you. We're all out of time, unfortunately, but thank you very much, Shashi, for being here and for supporting the festival as always. And thank you all for coming and braving the elements in this manner.
Yeah, I'm afraid I won't be signing. Will you announce it?
Another big thanks to Shashi Tharoor and MIHIR SWARUP Sharma. This session was presented by Dainik Bahaskar. And Shashi unfortunately does have to dash today to another appointment, but he has said that he will sign after his second session tomorrow, which I believe is at the Mogul tent, finishing at 5:15. So if you do want to have books signed by Shashi, you will be able to take the opportunity tomorrow at 5:15 to have your books signed. We'll ask you not to bother him at the moment. He has to dash, unfortunately.
दैनिक भास्कर, राजस्थान का सबसे बड़ा अखबार। दैनिक भास्कर, एक स्मार्ट सोच।